The hall was grand and filled with golden lights that dripped down from chandeliers like streams of sunlight caught in glass, and velvet curtains swayed slightly, as though they were alive, breathing with the air of anticipation that lingered in every corner. The atmosphere was heavy, but not with silence, rather with whispers and murmurs that danced from ear to ear like restless insects. The crowd had gathered in numbers far greater than the room could hold, and yet no one wanted to miss what was about to unfold. The girls stood in a line across the marble floor, each of them carefully dressed in their finest gowns, their faces glowing with powder and color that had been placed upon them to enhance what was already considered beautiful, their hair braided or curled in ways that caught the flicker of candlelight, their smiles rehearsed but convincing, for to them this moment was everything: the chance to be chosen, the chance to be noticed, the chance to be lifted from ordinary life into something brighter. The crowd leaned forward with eager eyes, hungry to see who would shine the most. Their whispers carried judgments, both kind and cruel. Some voices praised the tallest girl, her posture straight, her gown glittering with jewels like stars pinned to her body. Others admired the girl whose eyes sparkled with confidence, as though she already knew the future belonged to her. But among all these voices, a different sound drifted, low, almost like laughter, cruel and careless, aimed not at the ones who stood proud, but at the one who lingered at the farthest edge of the line. She was different. Her dress was plain and loose, her shoes worn, her hair untamed in a way that made her appear as though she had been pulled into this place without preparation. Her face carried no shine of powder, no glow of carefully painted beauty. Her hands trembled slightly, though she kept them tightly pressed together as if she feared what the world might do if she let them move. And most of all, her eyes were cast down toward the floor, refusing to meet the gaze of those who mocked her, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing pain. Yet in her stillness there was something quietly powerful, though no one seemed to notice. Not the crowd, not the other girls, and not even the ones who laughed, but the hall itself seemed to breathe around her, as if waiting for someone to look past the surface of her skin, to see the truth that lingered inside her chest, the truth that she herself perhaps had never truly seen. The man who had been given the right to choose stepped into the hall. His presence alone silenced 100 whispers, though not entirely, for curiosity always lingered in human hearts. He walked with calm steps across the marble, each footfall echoing softly like a drum in the distance. His eyes moved carefully from one girl to the next, studying the way they smiled, the way they stood, the way they sought his approval. And as he moved closer, the crowd leaned forward, their breaths held, waiting to see where his attention would fall. The crowd pointed eagerly as his eyes traveled across the line of girls, their whispers sharp and fast, as though they feared missing the chance to declare their judgment. The tallest girl stood with her chin high, her gown flowing like water around her legs, and they praised her grace, as though she had been born only to stand in this moment and be admired. Her confidence seemed to please them, for beauty paired with certainty is a combination most cannot resist. And other girls smiled with lips that had been painted red as roses, her laughter sweet and ringing like bells, and they praised her charm as though she carried the sun in her voice. Some leaned closer to each other, whispering that she would be the perfect choice for her family, was respected, and her future would shine like gold. Still others turned their attention to the girl with eyes that sparkled beneath the glow of candles. Her movements calculated, each glance a practiced performance designed to trap admiration. Crowd was relentless, their voices climbing and falling with excitement as they cast their invisible votes again and again, pointing fingers at those who looked the part of beauty, as if human worth could be measured by appearance alone. They clapped softly when the tallest one tilted her head and smiled. They gasped when the one with shining eyes twirled just slightly enough to make the jewels on her gown flicker. They laughed with delight when the girl with painted lips blew a kiss into the air. Yet behind the curtain of their praise there was cruelty. Their voices dropped when they spoke of the one at the edge of the line, their words sharper, their tone mocking. They compared her plain dress to the silk gowns of the others. They noted the mess in her hair, the wear on her shoes, the quiet way she stood as though she had been invited by mistake. One person whispered that she was unworthy. Another whispered that she should have stayed hidden at home, and their laughter carried like cold wind across the room. The girls in the center heard the whispers and felt taller for them. Their smiles widened, their eyes gleamed with the satisfaction that comes only when others are diminished. Yet the girl at the edge remained still. She did not lift her head, she did not defend herself. She simply stood with her hands pressed together, her breathing steady. her silence louder than the noise that surrounded her, and though the crowd failed to notice the man who watched them all did not. His gaze shifted with patience, though he gave every girl the courtesy of a glance. It was not the glittering gowns or the painted smiles that held his attention. It was the quiet figure at the end of the line, the one everyone else dismissed. As though she were invisible, he did not yet step forward. He simply observed, while the crowd continued to celebrate their favorites, their voices filled with certainty that his choice would be obvious to them. All but the silence in his chest told him something different, something deeper, something that no whisper could explain. At the far end of the line stood the girl who carried no jewels, no polish, no ornaments to catch the light. Her hair was tangled, her gown was plain, her shoes scuffed from many steps across rough ground, and she did not stand as though she belonged. Among the others, her shoulders bent slightly, her hands pressed together, as though she was bracing herself for what was to come. She had been told in countless ways before that she was not like the rest, that she was less, that her place was at the edge where eyes would not linger. Long the air around her felt different, not heavy, not bright, but still, as though time itself slowed down when it reached her corner. While the other girls gleamed under the eyes of the crowd, she seemed to dim the glow, not because she lacked light, but because her light was hidden beneath layers of silence, layers that no one cared to peel away. The whispers grew louder the closer the man moved toward her, yet still no one truly looked at her, no one except him. She kept her eyes low, her gaze locked on the marble floor, as though it were safer to look at stone than to risk the cruelty that often came when she dared to look up. She had learned long ago that meeting the eyes of others invited laughter, or pity, or worse. She had learned that silence was armor, though a fragile one that cracked in the solitude of her own thoughts. Still, she wore it faithfully in that hall, because without it she feared she would shatter completely. The crowd continued to trade words. Some said she was ugly, some said she was unworthy, some wondered why she was even there. Their voices layered over one another until they became a storm of sound crashing through the hall. Yet she stood unmoved, at least on the outside, for inside her chest her heart pounded and twisted with every word. Her breath trembled, though she forced it. Steady, she told herself that soon it would end. Soon he would choose one of the others, and she could return to the shadows where whispers did not pierce so sharply. But the man who walked among them did not see her as the crowd saw her. His steps slowed as his gaze moved toward the edge of the line. His eyes lingered, not on the jeweled gowns, not on the painted lips, but on her still figure. The crowd thought she blended into the background, but to him, she did not. She stood out, not because of what she lacked, but because of what she carried, a quiet weight, a truth unseen, a strength that she herself had not yet recognized. She shifted, slightly sensing his eyes, though she did not dare lift her head. Her fingers tightened together, her breath caught as though she feared being seen, and yet, for the first time in a long time, someone was truly looking at her, not with pity, not with scorn, but with curiosity, with something softer, something steadier, something that made the silence around her hum with possibility. The hall waited, the whispers swirled, and yet in that small corner, something rare was beginning, something that no one else had the eyes to see. The whispers grew sharper, cutting through the air like blades drawn in the dark. They were not whispers of wonder or praise. They were whispers of mockery and dismissal, their words cold enough to freeze the warmth in any heart. One voice called her ugly, another muttered that she was nothing more than a mistake placed on the stage to fill a space, and a third voice laughed so loudly it echoed against the velvet curtains, as though the insult itself deserved to be remembered. The girls beside her shifted slightly, some stealing glances at her from the corner of their eyes, their lips curling with hidden smiles that tasted of triumph. For every cruel word that fell upon her only seemed to lift them higher, as though the crowd was offering them crowns woven from the shame of another. One girl whispered to the tallest one that she need not worry about competition. Another smirked and flicked her jeweled gown, so that its sparkle would blind the room, as if to underline the difference between themselves and the one they mocked. Still, she did not move. Her head remained low, her shoulders rounded. She had lived with such voices for so long that they no longer startled her, but this did not mean they no longer hurt. Each word sank deep, like a stone dropped into water, rippling through her chest until her breath became heavy and tight. She had learned to bury her feelings beneath silence, to hide them behind stillness, for the world did not reward tears, it only punished them. And so she stood quiet, as if carved from stone, though inside she trembled. The crowd grew bolder with their words for cruelty gathers. Strength when shared, some laughed openly, pointing at her hair, at her shoes, at her plain gown. One man shook his head and muttered that she should have been hidden away. Another woman said that choosing her would be an embarrassment, and their words grew so loud that even those who had remained silent began to join in their voices, forming a storm of ridicule that spun around her like chains. Yet within that storm, his eyes did not waver. He watched her more intently with every word spoken against her. He did not see weakness in her silence. He saw strength. He did not see shame in her stillness. He saw resilience. He saw the way she held herself as though she had built walls not to keep others out but to keep herself standing when the world tried to tear her down. And in that strength he saw something rare, something the jeweled gowns and painted faces could never carry. He took another step closer, though the crowd did not notice, their attention fixed on their own noise. They expected him to look past her, to reach for one of the girls they adored. They believed the choice was already made because beauty, in their eyes, was the only path. Yet he knew already that their vision was blind, and he wondered how it was that none of them could see what he saw in her, how none of them could feel the quiet fire that lingered beneath her trembling hand. Though she kept her head bowed as though trying to hide from the cruelty she felt, the shift in the air, she felt his gaze like a light, piercing the shadows she had always lived within. Her chest rose with a breath deeper than before, and though her lips did not move, there was a spark in her silence that told a story far louder than the laughter around her. He felt it before he could name it, a pull, as though the world had narrowed to the small space where she stood and nothing else mattered. The golden lights, the whispers, the laughter, the glittering gowns all faded into the background, leaving only her figure standing quiet yet luminous in its own way. He took another step, and the marble beneath his feet seemed to hum with a resonance that echoed through his chest, a rhythm that matched the subtle beat of her own heart. Though she did not know he was there, she sensed it, to a feeling she could not place, a warmth in the pit of her stomach that was not fear, not anticipation, but something else, a whisper of recognition, as if someone else had finally seen the truth she had carried alone. For so long she kept her head lowered, as though by hiding her eyes she could protect herself from being discovered, and yet the discovery had already begun in the quiet strength of his gaze, and the crowd did not see it and would never understand it. The girls nearest to her noticed nothing. They were absorbed in themselves and in the attention showered upon them. They did not see the shift in the room. They did not feel the slow, quiet gravity drawing him closer to the one they dismissed. The tallest one pinned in her jewels, the girl with the painted lips twirled delicately as though the world were meant to admire her, and the one with the sparkling eyes fluttered her lashes, hoping to capture the light in his gaze. But the light he sought was not with them. Her hands pressed together tighter, as though trying to contain the sudden flutter that rose in her chest. She had never known that someone could look at her without pity, without mockery, without the assumption that she was less than the others. And yet, here he was, his eyes steady and unwavering, like they had traveled through countless distractions to reach only her. He did not flinch when the crowd hissed their cruel remarks. He did not falter when the girls smiled. For his attention, he was entirely present with her. She felt the weight of his gaze, and it was heavier than any whisper she had heard, yet somehow lighter than any touch she had felt, for it carried neither judgment nor expectation. It carried only recognition, as if he had seen her in a way the world had not allowed anyone to see, and a strange courage stirred inside her, the courage to stand taller, even if no one else acknowledged it, the courage to believe that she might matter for more than her appearance, the courage to imagine a world where her quiet strength could shine. He slowed his steps until he was almost in front of her, until the space between them felt charged as though a single moment could hold a lifetime. She could feel the anticipation rising in the room, though no one else noticed the tension that stretched invisible between them. The whispers of the crowd faded from her mind as she sensed the inevitable choice looming, the decision that would either confirm the cruelty of the world or rewrite what it meant to be truly seen. And in that moment, though her lips did not move and her head remained lowered, the tiny spark in her chest grew stronger. The part of her that had always longed to be recognized, dared to hope, dared to meet the unseen truth of his gaze, and dared to imagine that perhaps she was more than the world had allowed her to believe. The room seemed to hold its breath as he paused before her, the crowd leaning forward as though they could see the invisible thread that tied him to the girl they had ignored, yet they could not, for their eyes were clouded with expectation, their minds set on the obvious choices, and they waited impatiently for him to select the tallest, the prettiest, the one they deemed worthy, while he lingered in silence, and the girl at the edge felt every second stretch like an eternity. She did not move. She kept her gaze low, her fingers still pressed together, trembling slightly, though she did not know if it was fear or wonder or the strange pull that seemed to emanate from him and reach straight into her chest. She could hear the faintest shift of his footsteps as he drew nearer, a slow rhythm that made her pulse quicken with a combination of anticipation and disbelief, for she had spent so long invisible, and now someone had chosen to see her. The crowd murmured among themselves, voices rising in confusion. Some whispered that he must be joking, others that he could not possibly be serious. They pointed at the glittering gowns, the polished hair, the carefully painted faces, as though trying to force him to see what they saw. Yet he did not look at them. His attention never wavered from the plain figure before him, and the air around her seemed to shimmer with a quiet intensity that made the room feel smaller, and the whispers softer, as though reality itself had shifted. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a drum signaling both fear and exhilaration. She had imagined this moment countless times in her mind, yet never had it felt so real, so immediate, so overwhelming, and still she did not lift her head, for to do so would be to expose herself fully to the possibility that the world could still reject her, even at the last second. And yet, some small part of her longed to meet his eyes, longed to see the truth reflected in his gaze. He stopped mere inches away, and the air between them seemed electric, as though charged with the power of something unspoken, something older than the hall, older than the whispers, older than the glittering gowns. He extended his hand, slowly, deliberately, toward her, and in that motion he made a choice that would defy every expectation in the room. The choice that would change the way she saw herself and the way the world could never again ignore her. The whispers of disbelief rose like waves crashing over the edges of the hall, some voices sharp and incredulous, others soft with uncertainty, all turning toward her as if to question her worth, as if to demand an explanation for the impossible decision. Yet he did not falter. He smiled, only slightly, but with a certainty that carried the weight of truth, and in that moment she felt a courage unlike any she had known rise inside her, a courage that allowed her to finally lift her head and meet his gaze. Their eyes met, and in that instant the room ceased to matter. The whispers faded, the crowd blurred into shadows, and all that remained was the quiet intensity of recognition, the understanding that she had been seen truly, fully, and without judgment, and that nothing would ever be the same again for her, or for the world that had ignored her for so long. The hall erupted in murmurs and gasps as his choice became clear. The whispers that had hovered at the edges of conversation turned sharp and incredulous, some voices rising above the rest in disbelief, others quivering as though unsure they had heard correctly. The girls, who had stood proudly and confidently, now shifted uncomfortably, their eyes wide, their lips parted in shock. They had expected to be chosen, they had assumed their beauty and poise guaranteed them favor, and yet here he stood, pointing not at them but at the girl they had dismissed as plain and unworthy. The girl at the edge froze for a moment, her body stiff with surprise and a flicker of fear that had nothing to do with his gaze, for she had never imagined that anyone could defy the expectations of the world so boldly and choose her. She felt every eye in the room upon her, and the weight of disbelief pressing down as though the air itself had grown heavier around her. She could feel the stares slicing at her confidence, yet she also felt something else, a warm pulse of validation that spread from her chest down to her fingertips. Some of the girls whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting between him and her, their smiles faltering as confusion replaced certainty. They had been trained to compete for admiration, to shine and dazzle, yet none of their practiced brilliance mattered in that instant. None of their polished appearances could match the quiet force of the girl who had been ignored. They realized in a flash that beauty alone was not enough, that something far subtler and stronger had won the attention of the one who held power in that hall. The murmurs of the crowd became louder, their incredulity mounting as they tried to rationalize his choice. They called her ugly, they muttered that she could not possibly be special. They questioned his judgment, and some even scoffed openly, yet in their doubt and mockery they could not deny the intensity of the connection that seemed to radiate between them, as though some invisible thread bound his eyes to hers alone, and nothing else in the world mattered. Her chest heaved as she realized that he had chosen her, not out of pity or obligation, not because she had demanded attention, but because he had seen something in her that no one else could see, a quiet strength, a resilience that had been built in shadows, a spark of light that refused to be dimmed by cruelty or indifference, and for the first time she felt herself standing not at the edge of the line but at the center of something far larger than herself. He extended his hand and she hesitated only for a moment before reaching out to meet it. A shiver ran through her as their fingers touched and a spark seemed to ignite. In the room something unspoken and undeniable that neither the whispers nor the scorn could diminish. The crowd continued to murmur, but their voices had lost power. The drama of the moment had shifted, and the girl who had been invisible was now impossible to ignore. In that instant she felt a transformation take root inside her, a new awareness of her own worth, a courage to stand tall and claim the attention she had never dared to seek, a recognition that she was more than appearances, more than judgment, more than the shallow measures of beauty the world had long relied upon. And as she met his gaze fully, she knew that she had crossed a threshold from being unseen to being truly seen, and nothing would ever be the same again. The hall buzzed with chaos as the crowd tried to process what had just happened. Some people whispered frantically, trying to convince themselves that they had misunderstood. Others pointed fingers at her in disbelief, muttering that he could not possibly have chosen her, and yet she stood there calm in the eye of the storm, her hand still in his, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths that seemed to anchor her in a way she had never felt before. Her eyes lifted slowly to meet his, and the world fell away around her. The glittering gowns, the jeweled accessories, the carefully applied makeup, the whispers and gasps all blurred into shadows that could not touch the connection that hummed between them. For the first time she felt herself fully present, her spirit unshielded and yet unafraid. She felt the courage that had been building inside her over years of being overlooked crystallize into something sharp and radiant, as though she had finally found the strength to claim the space she deserved. The girls who had expected to be chosen recoiled in disbelief, their smiles faltering, their confidence shaken. They had practiced for moments like this. Their beauty and polish, their careful posture and rehearsed smiles had never failed before, yet now they stood silent as though the air itself had turned against them, their judgment and pride insufficient to sway the one whose eyes had already seen the truth in another. Some of the crowd whispered behind their hands. Some frowned, muttering that it was impossible. Some laughed, nervously trying to dismiss what they could not understand. And yet, despite their murmurs, a strange energy spread through the hall, a tension that vibrated from the girl at the edge to the man who had chosen her and back again. It was a pulse of inevitability, a recognition that something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be erased by disbelief or mockery. She lifted her head fully now, meeting his gaze without hesitation, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. As she realized that she was no longer the girl who had been invisible, she felt a fire awaken inside her, one that had been lying dormant under layers of doubt and fear. For the first time she saw herself as he saw her, someone worthy, someone remarkable, someone truly special, and the world could no longer deny it. Squeezed her hand gently, and she returned the gesture, feeling the warmth of his certainty flow into her like a current that chased away the years of silence and invisibility. The whispers of the crowd continued, but they became background noise, fading into irrelevance as she stood taller, her shoulders straightening, her heart swelling with a pride that was hers alone to claim. And as she breathed in the weight of the moment, she knew that she had stepped into a new chapter, a chapter where her worth was defined not by the opinions of others, but by the recognition of her own strength. In that charged silence, she felt the world beginning to shift around her. The impossible had happened, the overlooked had been chosen, and the choice resonated like a bell through the hall, a declaration that true value was not measured by polish or performance, but by the quiet depth of spirit that could not be ignored. And as she took her first steady steps forward, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The hall seemed to hold its breath as she stepped fully into the space that had always felt just out of reach. The crowd had not expected this outcome, and their murmurs and gasps echoed around her like distant thunder, but she no longer heard them. She only felt the rhythm of her own heartbeat, the warmth of his gaze, and the undeniable truth that she had finally been seen for who she truly was. Her steps were steady now, each movement carrying the weight of years spent hiding the quiet strength that had always been inside her, a strength the world had failed to recognize, but that he had chosen to honor in a way that left no room for doubt. She lifted her chin higher with each step, a subtle but powerful declaration that she belonged, that she was worthy, and that the shadows of invisibility could no longer claim her. The girls who had once looked down on her now looked up in confusion and disbelief, their polished appearances suddenly insufficient as they realized that the standards they had relied upon for validation were meaningless in the presence of something deeper and far more rare. They whispered to one another, questioning the choice, and yet they could not erase the truth that resonated across the room. The plain girl had been chosen because she carried something they could never manufacture, something that could not be imitated or adorned, something that was entirely her own. The crowd stilled slowly, their murmurs fading into silence as the energy in the hall shifted from doubt to awe. Some could not help but feel the gravity of what had occurred. They had witnessed the impossible. The overlooked had been honored, and in that recognition something profound settled over them, a reminder that beauty alone was fleeting and shallow, and that true value often lay hidden beneath surfaces unseen by the careless eye. She turned her gaze fully to him now, and their eyes locked in a quiet understanding that needed no words. He smiled softly, a smile that spoke of recognition, respect, and unwavering certainty, and in that moment, she realized that she had been waiting her whole life for this one act of acknowledgement, one affirmation that the depth of her spirit mattered more than the judgment of the world. Her hands, once pressed together in nervous restraint, now lifted freely to meet his in a gesture of trust and acceptance, a current of connection passing between them that carried all the unspoken years of longing, invisibility, and doubt and transformed them into something new, vibrant, and alive. She felt herself expanding into the space that had always been hers to claim, but that had been denied until this moment. The whispers began to dissolve entirely, replaced by a quiet reverence as the audience came to sense the magnitude of what had happened. They saw her not for what she lacked, but for what she had always carried inside. The quiet courage, the untamed spirit, the rare resilience that made her glow with a light that no external polish could rival, and in that recognition she felt a freedom she had never known, a release from every constraint imposed upon her by judgment and expectation. She breathed in deeply, her chest rising with a new certainty, her heart swelling with the knowledge that she was more than the world had allowed her to be, and as she stood tall in the hall, finally fully seen, fully honored, and fully herself, she understood that the moment had changed everything, and that nothing would ever be the same again, for her or for those who had failed to see her before. And in that final moment, the room felt transformed. The overlooked had become unforgettable, the ordinary had become extraordinary, and the girl who had once been invisible had finally stepped into the light of her own brilliance.